This is Pacifica Radio's Letters on Politics. On today's show,
what Hurston understood about African American folklore is that it was where we were going to find not only our understanding of the African American folk, but that which was original to the African American folk, that original aspect of us that had its roots in Africa.
Zora Neale Hurston is well remembered today for her novel Their Eyes Were Watching God and as a leading figure in the Harlem Renaissance. Not as well remembered, but as important as her work as a professionally trained anthropologist and her efforts to preserve African American folklore. For the first time, Zora Neale Hurston's first manuscript has been published into a book. It's called Barracoon, and it's about a man named Kosala, who was the last surviving person in 1927 that was kidnapped from Africa, enslaved in the United States, freed, and then had to figure out how to make a new life in a foreign land, that in the American South. We'll talk about these two remarkable stories, that of Kosala and that of Zora Neale Hurston, with Deborah G. Plant. She is a scholar of African American history, a specialist on Zora Neale Hurston, and editor of this new book called Barracoon. That's next on Letters on Politics. But first, the news.
For Pacifica Radio, I'm Scott Baba. Senior officials from the United States, Qatar, and Israel are expected to join the third day of talks between Israel and Hamas in the Egyptian resort of Sharm el-Sheikh. It's a sign negotiators aim today to tackle the toughest issues of an American plan to end the war in Gaza. Nick Harper has more.
Negotiations are now in their third day as all sides try and find enough common ground to make the US proposed peace plan a reality. The indirect talks between Israel and Hamas are taking place in Egypt with the help of Qatar's Prime Minister, Turkey's intelligence chief, and now joining US envoys Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner. Wednesday's discussions could prove pivotal, with a cautious optimism now pervading the talks. Hamas's list of Palestinian prisoners includes some of the most high-profile detainees that are currently still being held by Israel. In return, the group says it will hand over the remaining hostages, both alive and dead. I'm Nick Harper in Washington.
Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan said today that the talks on bringing an end to the war in Gaza are on the verge of reaching a ceasefire. Fidan told a news conference in Ankara with Syrian Foreign Minister Assad al-Shabani, quote, "If an agreement is reached today, a ceasefire will be declared." Fidan earlier said that a lot of progress has been achieved so far in the negotiations. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has repeatedly said that, quote, "No one has died because of his government's decision to gut its foreign aid program, USAID. But in Myanmar, families report their loved ones have died as a direct result of the aid cuts. In one case, the father of a 2-year-old boy says his son died in May of malnutrition after the family's food rations stopped arriving as a result of the aid cuts. In more than 60 interviews, the Associated Press documented widespread suffering across Myanmar because of the U.S. decision. Healthcare services have been hobbled, the sick and starving have wasted away, and people must forage for hours in the jungle each day to find food. A courtroom in Washington, D.C. has become the latest battleground over President Donald Trump's federal law enforcement intervention. A lawsuit challenges the ongoing National Guard deployment in the nation's capital. States have taken sides along party lines, with 23 Republican-led states supporting the Trump administration and 22 Democratic-led states backing Washington's opposition. The lawsuit was filed by Washington's Attorney General and argues the deployment is unlawful and unconstitutional. The case highlights deep divisions over Trump's use of military forces in cities. States that could face their own deployments are closely watching the case. Legal experts differ over how they think the case will play out. Former FBI Director James Comey pleaded not guilty today to face criminal case that has thrown a spotlight on the Justice Department's efforts to target adversaries of President Donald Trump. Comey entered a not guilty plea through his lawyer at the federal courthouse in Alexandria, Virginia, to allegations that he lied to Congress 5 years ago. The plea kickstarts a process of legal wrangling in which defense lawyers will almost certainly move to get the indictment dismissed before trial, possibly by arguing the case amounts to selective or vindictive prosecution. The indictment 2 weeks ago followed an extraordinary chain of events that saw Trump publicly implore Attorney General Pam Bondi to take action against Comey and other perceived adversaries. The Republican president also replaced the veteran attorney who had been overseeing the investigation with Lindsay Halligan, a White House aide who had never previously served as a federal prosecutor. Halligan rushed to file charges before a legal deadline lapsed, despite warnings from other lawyers in the office that the evidence was insufficient for an indictment. The UN's refugee agency has warned nearly 22,000 people fled their homes in northeastern Mozambique in a single week last month due to a resurgence in fighting across the province of Cabo Delgado. Isaac Lucando reports.
The UN Refugee Agency says the late September surge in displacement marks a turning point in Mozambique's conflict, now in its 8th year, with more than 100,000 people uprooted in 2025. The violence in Cabo Delgado, which began in 2017, has grown into a complex crisis, worsened by cyclones, floods and drought. All 17 districts have now been affected, displacing more than 1.3 million people. The agency warns families are reaching their limit as civilians face killings, abductions, sexual violence, and forced child recruitment.
And that was Isaac Lucando reporting. The U.S. National Hurricane Center says Tropical Storm Jerry has strengthened in the Atlantic Ocean on a path towards the Caribbean. Jerry had maximum sustained winds of 50 miles per hour early this morning. It is expected to strengthen into a hurricane in the coming days. Meanwhile, Hurricane Priscilla continues to churn in the Pacific Ocean off the coast of Mexico. Its top winds were at 105 miles per hour last night. A tropical storm watch is in place for the Baja California Sur. Hundreds of miles further out in the Pacific, Tropical Storm Octavie is weakening far from the southern tip of Baja California. Meanwhile, at least 15 people have died after a bus was hit by a massive landslide in a mountainous region of northern India. Authorities say the number of casualties from this accident could rise as the rescue operation continues. Triyoshi Mukherjee reports.
Witnesses say that due to continued heavy rain in Himachal Pradesh, a big chunk of mountain came crashing down and the bus on the road below carrying around 30 passengers was hit by rolling boulders. Local officials have warned the chances of survival are bleak. Himachal Pradesh's chief minister has given orders to take the injured to nearby hospitals for treatment. Personnel from India's National Disaster Relief Forces have been deployed to the Himalayan state to help with rescue and relief. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi expressed his grief and announced $2,200 to the families of those who have died in this accident. In the past 2 months, torrential rains have battered the state, triggering landslides and flash floods that have caused widespread damage across the region. Sriyoshi Mukherjee, New Delhi.
I'm Scott Baba for Pacifica Radio.
Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. Over the course of doing this radio program for the past 15 years, I have developed a strong interest, maybe we can say love, maybe we can even say obsession, for stories. I know you've heard me say this many times, but I have come to see stories as being fundamental to the human experience. We learn through stories. We form community through stories, religion just being one example. We love through stories, and we also hate through stories. We go to war over stories, and we remember through stories. We even see our own lives as a story. It is this deep interest that I have in stories that I will continue to explore as I move on to other work outside of this program, onto other projects. I do feel I must continue saying this at the top of the show for all of our stations across the country that air this program. The last day of the program will be on October 16th. Stations are welcome to re-air programs from the past as a bridge to get them to their next good thing. For people who want to stay in touch with me, it's easy. I'm on social media. You can also email me at mitch@kpfa.org. I am ending my employment at the station, but I'll still be around. I've also started a very personal podcast. It's called Letters from Mitch. I call it that because, well, that's what it is, a letter from me to you, in which I'll tell you stories about myself and about the stories that I'm interested in. You can also find this on Substack, where the audio and a transcript is included. There's a few things up there now, but nothing serious. I'm just experimenting with things. But if you do want to find me, and you can't spell my last name because most people can't, even though it's exactly how it sounds, it's simple. Jeserich. The funny thing is, I think I'm the only one who pronounces it as Jeserich. Everyone in my family says Jeserich. And I can't explain what happened to me. Today, I want to bring you an interview from the past. That's one of my favorites, and that is very much about stories, specifically African American stories and folklore. This is an interview about the great American writer Zora Neale Hurston, and about the presumed last living African man who was kidnapped from his home and brought to the United States to be enslaved. Later turned out there were a couple of others who were also still alive. It's about Zora Neale Hurston's relationship to this man known as, from his American name, Cudjo Lewis, or his given name, Oluwale Kosala. Zora Neale Hurston is well remembered for her books of literature, especially her iconic Their Eyes Were Watching God. Not as well known until perhaps more recent years is that Zora Neale Hurston was a trained anthropologist whose work centered around finding and preserving African American folklore. As part of this work, she interviewed Oluwale Kosala and wrote down his story and turned it into a manuscript to be published. But it was never published in her day because she refused the publisher's request to change Oluwale's dialect to make it easier, presumably for white people, to read. You will remember Zora Neale Hurston in her novels finally captured the dialect of African Americans in the early 20th century, both in the South and the North. Remember, she was also a prominent figure of the Harlem Renaissance, and today she is celebrated for all of that. But her book remained unpublished until 2018, when it finally was. It was in 2018 that I had the great opportunity to speak to the book's editor, Deborah G. Plant, about Zora Neale Hurston, Oluwale Kosala, and about the book that is called Barracoon, the story of the last black cargo. Deborah G. Plant, it is my very good pleasure to welcome you to this program.
Well, thank you, and it's my pleasure to be here. I look forward to our conversation about Barracoon.
As do I, and also to talk about Zora Neale Hurston as an anthropologist, which is a very important story. Again, I think most people know of Zora Neale Hurston for her book, Their Eyes Were Watching God, but also important is her anthropological work. So let's begin there. Tell me about Zora Neale Hurston as an anthropologist.
Hurston, as an anthropologist, as a social scientist in general, is someone who's just vital to everything about what we understand about African Americans, the African American folk, and what have you, and that aspect of study in terms of anthropology at large. So what we know is that Hurston began her anthropological studies at Barnard College, where she came into the knowing, the knowledge of Franz Boas, who is the renowned father of American cultural anthropology. And so she took courses at Columbia where he was a professor. And she studied with him. She studied with Melville Herskovitz, Ruth Benedict. She knew Margaret Mead, all of these kinds of things. And so she was very young, in terms of her years as a college student into that field. And what I mean by that is that she began to study anthropology before she even completed her undergraduate degree at Barnard College in English. And so we see this formalizing of her skill and ability in relation to social science and in specific relation to anthropology and ethnography and folklore collecting. But in reality, it started in Eatonville, where she listened to the stories of people in her town the sermons that her father would give on a Sunday morning in church and things of that nature. And, she loved telling stories herself, and she loved listening to stories. And she would talk about in Dust Tracks on the Road, her autobiography, she would talk about how she would go to Joe Clark's store, and she would be listening, to the stories and the storytellers. And then she would just, as she put it, drag her feet getting back home. Her mother would have to call for her to come back home because she was so immersed in listening to these stories. And in doing that, of course, she was developing her ear, not just learning the content of stories and form of stories and how they're told and what have you, but also the listening, which is very important in terms of her ethnographic skills. And so you could say that she was a storyteller as well as, a social scientist who understood those very basic ideas about ethnography, even from her earliest years. And this is very important because this is a major part of who she is. We know her, like you said, mostly in relation to Their Eyes Were Watching God. So we know her as a writer, as a novelist. But this part of her, the social science part of her, we are not that familiar with. And we don't yet, until now, have the kind of perspective that allows us to understand her on that level. So what we have with Barracoon is her first book-length work. And this book, which was not published until now, she completed a draft of it in 1931. This constitutes her first work. And she was writing that story while she was also very much immersed in collecting folklore, folk tales in that region. And she was also working on formulating her ideas about Muse and Men, which was her other major anthropological work. And so these works come at the forefront of her career, not later, although they were published later.
This is all happening before she becomes this known writer.
Absolutely. We haven't had Jonas Gorvine yet, which was published in 1934. Certainly not Their Eyes, which came later in 1937, or her later works. All of this is going on before we know her as a writer of novels. The best we know about her as a writer before Jonas Gorvine is in relation to the short stories that she wrote and won awards for and that kind of thing. So we have a sense of her writing as a writer through those short stories, but the novels began to come in 1934.
Tell me about the importance she put in particular, African-American folklore. I think these are my words, but I think she says something to the effect of African-American folklore was this country's greatest asset.
Yeah, her perception and feeling that African-American folklore was the greatest cultural wealth on the continent. What Hurston understood about African-American folklore is that it was where we were going to find not only our understanding of the African-American folk, but that which was original to the African-American folk, that original aspect of us that had its roots in Africa. This is very important in relation to the objectives of the Harlem Renaissance period, where Harlem's Renaissance pundits were looking for exploring ways to basically show and present to white America that which was original to African Americans. And Hurston knew that from her studies as an anthropologist that the repository of those aspects that were original to African Americans would be amongst the folk. And so she had the skills, one of the very few to have the skills to go amongst the folk, being of the folk herself, and being able to collect the songs, the tales, the stories, the sermons, all of those forms of oral cultural expression. And what's very important about that is, it's through cultural expression that people tend to evaluate a people. You know, what culturally do you bring to the table of humankind and human evolution? What's your contribution to that? And it was assumed, because of racism and prejudice and stereotypes and all of that, that African Americans had nothing. And so the Harlem Renaissance period was about saying, yes, we do. And, you know, it was the job of those what they call young new Negroes at the time to present these cultural artifacts.
I think of Elaine Locke, who we've done a show on not too long ago.
Well, yes, he was very much at the forefront of the Harlem Renaissance period, and you know he's considered one of the architects of that period, along with W.B. Du Bois and Charles Johnson and James Weldon Johnson and people of that nature. And this is what they would do. This part of their job, so to speak, was to find these quote unquote young new Negroes and support them in every way that they could in terms of their work and their ability to produce, connecting them with publishers, with producers, with people who had money and all of that kind of thing, so that they could produce those forms of cultural expression that could then be basically shown to the world to say, yes, we have a rich heritage too. And not only that, one of the important things about Hurston and her work is that what she wanted to do by way of introducing the public, the reading public, to the African American folk is what she says in her introduction to Music Men. She says she wanted us to see that which the soul lives by. And that's very important because it was assumed by many who were, you know, tainted with notions of white supremacy and what have you, that not only were African Americans not human, we lacked some depth of spirit. And this was, you know, one of the ideas, the notions that Hurston was very committed to debunking, not through any confrontation, so to speak, against those ideas and ideologies, but by showing what we have. Not only in books, the books that she wrote, but also in terms of her work as a dramatist.
Zora Neale Hurston in 1927 would travel to Mobile, Alabama, where we have Oluwale Kosola, also known as Cujo Lewis. What name do you go by in conversation?
I use Kosola.
Then we'll go with Kosola. Mm-hmm. She goes and meets Kosola in Mobile, Alabama. Again, Kosola, he's not an unknown figure at this time.
That's right.
He's been written about before by others.
Yes. But she goes mainly because it's part of her assignment when she's in the field on behalf of Carter G. Woodson, who was the editor of the Journal of Negro History and Culture, and also on behalf of Franz Boas, her professor and mentor. Carter G. Woodson had heard about Kosola, and he had heard about his experience of being captured on the continent of Africa, and he wanted Hurston to capture that story for him. And so while she's in the field, she goes to Mobile, to Africatown, which is that community called Plateau today, but then it was just simply Africatown, which is not very far from Mobile in Alabama. So she goes there to ask Kosola about his experiences being captured and brought to Alabama by way of the Middle Passage. And she interviews him as well as collects information from the Alabama Historical Society, and she compiles that into a report that she submits to him. And so that is the beginning of her communication with Kosola. So evidently she saw and felt and heard in Kosola's story much, much more that she could get from him in terms of his full story. And so she returns to Africatown toward the latter part of 1927 in December, And she comes again in January, February of 28. And she, over that period of time, begins to have those interviews with him, have those conversations with him, where she draws him out and gets his full story about his life before captivity, the capture, the being detained at the Barracoons at the coast of Ouida, what we know it today as Benin, and the Middle Passage into enslavement in Alabama, and his life afterwards. So she managed to capture the full spectrum, the full continuum of his life over that period of time.
Deborah Plant, let's talk about Oluwole Kosola. His story in itself is fascinating. As I said at the beginning, there are really two fascinating stories here that we're talking about that intersect, Kosola and also Zora Neale Hurston. Tell me about, he lives in Africa, Western Africa, I think in around Nigeria, is that correct?
In that region, yes.
Yeah, and he was there until 19. So his formidable years, he really did grow up in Western Africa.
That's right. He grew up in a town called Bante, and he was an Isha Yoruba, and they were an agricultural people and also a peaceful people. And Kosola talks about his growing up time, the customs and the rituals that he experienced growing into his young manhood, learning how to hunt, learning how to track, learning how to defend his community, becoming a soldier, not so much a soldier so that, they can conduct campaigns of war, but because there were those groups that did conduct campaigns of war, they needed to be in some way prepared to protect and defend themselves. And so he was one of the, he had membership in the Oro Society, which was that group of young men who were pledged to take care of their community. And so, and he talks about being a young man who sees a girl and he wants to, maybe marry her. And so he tells his parents, when you see so-and-so, you be kind to her, you be nice to her. And so, this is an indication that he's ready to get married. And he's in the process, actually, of going through the ritual to prepare him for marriage when there's this raid on his village. And so he talks about how, the Amazon warriors, these were women soldiers who were part of the Daomian army, who entered into their homes, their village in pre-dawn time and just surprised them in their waking and just committed all kind of violence and slaughter and capturing those that they felt were able-bodied and could be good, quote-unquote, specimens as slaves. And so he saw his king be killed and beheaded, and so many of his community in his village to be, destroyed. And it was just an awful, traumatic event that he never really could get past that. And, who could? Because in that raid, he lost everyone he knew. Everyone he knew.
When he told Zora Neale Hurston this, and when he was done relaying the story, she just left him as he just stared, I think, at smoke from a fire. Couldn't even, like he was so wrapped up in his own thoughts.
Exactly.
He didn't say goodbye.
Yes, exactly.
And many years later.
Yeah, and that's how indelibly marked, this experience was on his mind and his heart and his soul. And it's very important, she captures this and she presents it in the narrative in such a way that we feel his pain. We're right there with him, looking, into the abyss of the past where such trauma had taken place. And what's very important about this is that this trauma that African peoples experience if you have any human feeling in you at all, you can't help but be touched by that. And you can't help but understand something about the soul of a human being and how that trauma can just really, it has such a terrible effect on the body, mind, and the spirit.
I want to talk more about this raid that happens to his village when he's 19 in West Africa. And just to be clear, at the time, these are not slave traders. These are not white slave traders. This is a nearby kingdom. And this kingdom, and maybe talk a little bit about this dynamic. My understanding is this kingdom was a very powerful kingdom, a very rich kingdom, and it was that way because what it did was it captured people, Africans, neighbors, and sold them into slavery.
Yes, absolutely. The Fawn of Dahomey were just this horrific, very powerful entity in that region. You know, there's so much about the Dahomean people and their heritage, their culture, their customs, you know, really remarkable and wonderful. And at the same time, there's this aspect of their culture and society, which basically allowed them the belief and the will to capture others within their environment. And this is how they, quote unquote, grew their wealth as well as their power, and they were a dominant force. What they would do is as you know, the Dahomean army would move through the area, the region, and you know, depending on what particular village they were passing, you know, they would ask for food, for provisions for their army. If they were not provided, it was assumed that, okay, you're at war with the kingdom of Dahomey.
That's right. You either provide us food because we are a warring dynasty or a kingdom, so we're not making our own food. So you either provide us with food, and if not, then we're going to take you as slaves. I mean, that was the deal, right?
Exactly. Yeah. That was it. And Kosala's king refused to give up the food that was needed to feed his people. He said, this is for my people. I can't do that. They didn't declare war as such, and they didn't conduct war at that time, but they came back. They went on about their business and circled back and caught them at that pre-dawn time. And like you said, those that they captured, well, they had two uses for the people that they captured. They would use them in their own ceremonies in Dahomey at Abomey, where the capital was, or they would detain them in these barracoons and then sell them to Europeans who would come to get their so-called cargo. So, yes, and in doing that, they waxed rich and became even more powerful. So, yeah, it was the Fawn of Dahomey who dominated that region, who captured Kosala, people from his village and people from surrounding villages, because the warriors were actually coming down from the north, and when they also waged their campaign against Kosala's village.
And the warriors were women.
The warriors were women and men.
Yeah.
They were women and men. The Amazons were women. And Kosala talks about how fierce they were. And as he describes it in his narrative, it was the Amazons who came into the homes within the village. It was the women who came in to those rooms to where they were sleeping or just waking up and committed that awful slaughter. The male warriors were positioned outside around the walls of the village, so that those that the Amazons had not captured or killed and who were trying to escape, if they were able to escape the Amazon women, then the male warriors would then either kill or capture them. So the way it was set up, the women would go in and basically, initiate the first round of slaughter and capture. Any who managed to escape them would be then either slaughtered or captured by the male warriors.
Just a gruesome story. And as I said earlier, Zora Neale Hurston describes him telling this story as being lost in his own thoughts, not even being aware of his own surroundings. And she just gets up and leaves, and he doesn't say goodbye, like we pointed out earlier. But I have to tell you, when I'm reading that part, I also am fully engrossed in that story. And I too forget about where I am when I was reading that part. Deborah Plant, can you tell me again, his name is Kosala, but in America he uses Cujo Lewis. Why that name?
The way he explains it in the narrative is that for whites, as he put it, his name was too crooked to call. And so initially, Kosala has only one name, and it's Kosala. And it's only after his, acculturation process into American society and culture that he chooses a second name, which was his father's name. That's where Oluwale comes from. That was the name of his father. He says in the African soil, we have only one name. But here in the American soil, you have to have two. And so where Cujo comes from is that it's a West African name that means boy child born on a Monday. So Cujo is not very far from his cultural roots. And Lewis, I'm not absolutely sure, but I think it's some kind of variation of Oluwale or Lewis, right? So because not very many people in America would take the time to pronounce his name correctly, Kosala, he just went by that, as he says in the narratives. Like, well, since basically you quote unquote own me, then that's what we'll use. And so he used that name, Cujo Lewis, but we're very clear that this is not his choice. This is not his choice in terms of how he identifies himself. And we know that because when Hurston goes to visit with him and, to continue the interviews, she calls him Kosala. And he responds, and she says, when she calls him that, he just lights up and he responds, he says, I know it's you. I know it's you calling my name, because nobody calling my name from across the water but you. And as they get into the interview, he tells her very, very adamantly, very clearly, very passionately, he says, my name, not Cujo Lewis. My name, Kosala. And that's why I refer to him as Kosala, because this is how he identified. This is who he was for himself. What he allowed others to do in terms of how they called him, that was a matter of convenience, practicality, and, on a certain level of submission to people who were going to basically call you what they wanted to call you anyway. But in his own environment, in his own sense of who he was Kosala.
Tell me about the founding and development of Africatown.
1865, April the 10th, I believe it was. The Union soldiers have come into Alabama, and Kosala is there working, loading or unloading materials from one of the ships, the steamboats that he worked on. And the Union soldiers see him and they tell him, and says, you're free. You don't have to do that anymore. You don't have to stay here anymore. You don't have to work for these people anymore. You're free. And being free, well, there's being free, and then there is, okay, now within this new status that I have, what do I do? And the soldiers told them, like, you know, there are some houses there that you can go where you can have some kind of some place to stay and that kind of thing. But basically they had to figure it out for themselves what to do. They didn't have, Kosala and his compatriots, they didn't have, you know, anyone to come and tell them about the Freedmen's Bureau and all of that kind of thing. Some others in the environment did, but he did not. And in their starting over, they had a little shelter, but in the starting over, what they did was basically begin to work at those places where they were held in bondage. In doing that work and getting paid some little wage for that, they thought that they could go home. They could save enough money to return to their home, which is what they wanted to do, always wanted to do. And when they found that they could never save enough because the passage, the cost was so dear, that they resolved that they had to stay in where they were in Alabama. And having resolved to stay where they were, they said, well, we're going to need some land to build our houses on. They couldn't just, you know, continue to stay in the shelters that they were in. They wanted their own homes. And so their reasoning was that, you know, Timothy Meyer brought them over they stole them and brought them over into Alabama, took them away from a land where a home where they had land, and they had means to make a living for themselves, and they were taken away from that and brought into Alabama. So their reasoning was that Timothy Meyer ought to assist them in getting back to Africa, for one thing, and that's when they decided they would try to save and return. They decided they would do that themselves rather than ask Meyer for passage home. But when they found that they couldn't go, they said that they would ask Timothy Meyer for some land so that they could build their homes. So Kosala was chosen by the group to go and speak with Timothy Meyer. And he's in the woods one day chopping. Timothy Meyer had a paper mill and all that kind of thing. And so he was working, chopping wood when Timothy Meyer came, and Kosala said, you know, he felt like this was the right time to speak for his people, to speak for land for his people. So he stops chopping, this tree that he's chopping down, and Timothy Meyer is there, and as Kosala puts it, no longer does he hear the axe fall on the tree, and so he looks up and he asks Kosala, "Why are you so sad?" And Kosala says, he wants land so bad for his people that he just wants to cry. And so he tells him, he says, "Captain Tim, you brought us here to America. We had land in Africa, and over here we have nothing. They free us, but they free us with nothing. And, since you brought us here, why don't you give us a little piece of this land?" And Timothy Meyer jumps up and he calls him a fool. He says, "Fool, do you think I'm going to throw property after property? I'm not going to give you anything. I took good care of my slaves during slavery time, and you don't belong to me no more anyway. I don't owe you anything." And so this is what Kosala had to take back to his community. And so what the community decided was, you know what? Then we'll just buy that piece of land. And so they worked, the men worked, the women worked, and they pooled their monies, and they bought one parcel of land and then another, and amongst them, from 1 acre to 2 to 3 to however many that, they were able to buy. Then on that land, they founded Africatown. Once they had the land, as Kosala explains it in his narrative, then they didn't get hire people to build their houses for them. They built their houses themselves, and they would all help one another to, communally build the houses that for people who were ready to build their houses. And so this is how, this is the foundation of Africana.
Again, we have been in conversation with Deborah G. Plant about Barracoon, the book that was written by Zora Neale Hurston about Olawale Kosala. And there you're hearing about Africa Town. And this was just one of my favorite interviews, I think, from our past. And you're listening to Letters and Politics on listener-sponsored KPFA in Berkeley, KFCF in Fresno, and KPFK in Los Angeles. I'm Mitch Jeserich, coming to you here near the end of our fall fund drive, which will be wrapping up at my home station, KPFA, at the end of the week. And as I speak to you right now, we are $117,000 away from reaching our goal. It can be within reach. We're still pretty far away. We're about 73% of the way towards our goal. So we're far beyond 75% of the way through this fund drive. However, from recent past, we can, in the final 2.5 days here, raise $117,000, but it's going to require every hour making its goal. And I want to tell you, we can make our goal today of $3,000 if we just raise $1,500. Why? Because John in Oakland has put up $1,500. And if by the top of the hour, about 15 minutes from now, if we can raise collectively $1,500, it will turn into $3,000 for KPFA, my home radio station. Of course, we ask for a contribution that you can afford, one that's according to your means, one you feel good about as you go upon your day, knowing that you did your part. We have thank you gifts. The book Barracoon, The Story of the Last Black Cargo by Zora Neale Hurston is available for a contribution of $110. There's also another version of Barracoon adopted for young readers. It's called Barracoon, adapted for young readers by Zora Neale Hurston, and it was created by Dr. Ibram X. Kendi. And it is turned into a book for young folks that include a lot of illustrations. So you have the Barracoon that's adopted for young folks, or you have the Barracoon, the actual manuscript, the book written by Zora Neale Hurston. Each of these available for a contribution of $110. If you want to get both of them, one for you, one for a young person, you can do so at the discounted rate of $180. You get both books, and we'll also throw in the Letters and Politics U.S. History Collection, which is a link of dozens and dozens of shows that we have done on American history over the years, and includes this conversation about Zora Neale Hurston and Barracoon. The phone number for KPFA listeners is, and this is also true for KFCF listeners, and the challenge begins now, 1-800-439-5732. 1-800-439-5732, and online at kpfa.org. In Southern California, listening to KPFK in Los Angeles, the number you're going to call is 818-985-5735. 818-985-5735, and online at kpfk.org. Friends, today is the second to last day that I will ask you for a financial contribution during this show, Letters and Politics. Not just for this drive, but forever. Again, the final show is scheduled for next Thursday. I have received a number of kind notes from many of you, heartfelt notes, in fact, and I've read each one, whether it be from an email or a letter. I may not have seen every letter because I'm not always at the station, but I have received several letters or posts on social media like Facebook. I have read them, each of them. And I was touched. I am touched deeply. It has been hard to respond to all of them personally, not because that there are thousands of them or even hundreds of them. They're not. But there's definitely dozens and dozens of them. And it's been hard to respond because they have been such personal notes in which real emotion have been expressed, including the emotion of sadness. And I feel that. And I didn't want to just respond with a flippant thank you note. Well, thank you very much for listening. Yours truly, Mitch Jeserich. When these notes began coming in, I did what I always do. I said, well, I'll get back to it later. Because I just didn't, when I get something that has something that's heartfelt, I usually like to sit with it for a moment. And as I did that, then another note would come in, and then another one after that. And now I'm so far behind, I don't know if I can get to them. I mean, perhaps after next Thursday, I'll have a lot more time. We'll see about that. But perhaps the very best I can do is just here to let you know I've seen them, I feel them. They make me a little sad too, to be honest. But thank you. And when we do these fundraisers, I see so many of the same names over the years again and again and again supporting this wonderful radio station. And many of you left kind notes too. And I thank you. And I thank you because, boy, you've inspired me because you don't have to give to this radio station, and yet you still have. And I admire that. I'm an admirer of Henry David Thoreau, and when I see people give freely to something that they support, even though they don't have to, but understanding if nobody does then give, this can't be here, this radio station. And so they do it. They do it as a civic duty. They do it as a member of the community. And it reminds me of, again, that man I admire, Henry David Thoreau, who put out a call to live life deliberately. Again, we're talking about 15 people getting the book, Barracoon, at $110. We make this challenge. It could be 30 people donating $75 or $50. I'm not a mathematician. The number for KPFA listeners and KFCF listeners is 1-800-439-5732. 1-800-439-5732. And online at kpfa.org. In Southern California, listening to KPFK in Los Angeles, the number is 818-985-5735. 818-985-5735 and online at kpfk.org. We are $305 towards that $1,500 challenge. We have about 7 minutes remaining in the hour. I do have to tell you, that, and as you know, I am the voice of this show because I am the host of this show. So I am the one that you know about, who gets the public attention, who gets the public praise, and also sometimes gets blame as well. It's part of the job. But I want you to know I'm not the only one who works on this program. From the very beginning, Kirsten Thomas has been our engineer, has been at the controls, pushing the buttons, and making sure everything technically happens that needs to happen to get this show on the air. And she is a master at it. And when I say master, I really mean the word master. Like a master sword fighter or a master Tai Chi practitioner. She is a master behind the controls. You walk into the studio and you see her. And there she is behind these controls, behind this big old board with all these buttons and lights. And there's just like a calmness around her. Like she knows everything and has her hands on it and her fingers on the button. And I am wildly thankful to her. We are now $405 towards that $1,500 challenge. The number again is for KPFA listeners and KFCF listeners, 1-800-439-5732, 1-800-439-5732, and online at kpfa.org. Southern California, listening to KPFK in Los Angeles, 818-985-5735, 818-985-5735, and online at kpfk.org. Then there's Deanna Martinez, this show's producer, who has also been involved with the program from the beginning. She is the driving force behind the show, who never gets the credit she deserves. She's the one who does all the work off air, which is a lot more than just on air. She gives the show editorial direction. She finds the guests. She gets them on the show. Sometimes she has to cajole them to come on, and she's excellent at doing it. Why? Because she's just likable. I can't tell you how many times I've interviewed someone who told me before we began the interview, just, oh, how wonderful your producer, Deanna Martinez, is. They're always asking, how's Deanna? And the truth is, and I don't think I'm alone in saying this, she is the most pleasant person I have ever known in my life. When you work with someone every day for years, you really get to know that person. And believe me, she knows me very well. And she knows how moody I can get. Kirsten knows this too. How I act when I'm frustrated. And just really another side of me that one tries to hide from most people, but obviously is there because I am human just like everyone else. And yet through it all, seriously, she's pleasant. It's crazy, actually. I've never met anyone quite like her. Because we work in a very stressful environment, very stressful job, I frequently act in a way that I will regret later. Sometimes you even know it when you're doing it, but you can't stop it. But she maintains her equanimity through it all. And I admire her. And she's never gotten the praise that she deserves and for what she has done to this show. But she deserves it. So hats off, Deanna Martinez. You are the best. You really are. Again, for KPFA listeners and KFCF listeners, please support this historic radio station that gave me the opportunity that no one else would ever give me by giving a call at 1-800-439-5732. 1-800-439-5732 and online at kpfa.org. In Southern California, listening to KPFK in Los Angeles, the number is 818-985-5735. 818-985-5735 and online at kpfk.org. Frank in New York. Thank you, Frank, all the way from New York for your contribution. Barracoon Logic in, what's this, Duncan's Mills. It's a very nice note. I thank you. Thank you for your generosity. Richard in Los Altos. Richard, I thank you for your generosity as well. The number again for KPFA. Well, let me give KPFK listeners the number first this time. 818-985-5735. 818-985-5735 and online at kpfk.org. For my friends in the San Francisco Bay Area and the Central Valley, the number is 1-800-439-5732. That's for KPFA. 1-800-439-5732 and online at kpfa.org. We are now $75 away from this challenge. You still have time in the next hour to get your call in. Melissa, extremely generous of you. Thank you. Joseph in San Francisco, thank you as well. 1-800-439-5732, 1-800-439-5732, and online at kpfa.org. Thank you.
You're tuned in to 94.1 KPFA and 89.3 KPFB in Berkeley, 88.1 KFCF in Fresno, online at kpfa.org.